All right, folks. This is a kind of a second video reflection on my experience at the Pettit Center for 12 hours, where I broke the 100-mile world record and 12-hour world record. The first video I did was more of a kind of a reflection on kind of my history in that particular style of event, as well as a little bit of a kind of video race report. So if you're more interested in kind of that side of things, definitely check out that video. I'll link it to the notes on this one as well so you can get to it easier. The purpose of this video is essentially to kind of go through a little bit of how my training blocks led me to the event itself, so you can have a little bit of background knowledge of kind of how I chose to prepare for this particular event. It's probably worth noting that since I've moved to Phoenix, Arizona, I've had a lot more opportunities to train in kind of a variety of environments. We got a lot of, desert trail. I can get up to Flagstaff pretty easily and get into the mountains and things like that if I want to. So like picking a goal race, there's just a lot more options if I want to like really specify to it. So what I've kind of been doing since moving here a year and a half ago is dividing my year in kind of two halves, where half the year I'll do kind of more trail based stuff, and the other half of the year I'll do some more flatter, faster type attempts. So this year, I was actually kind of uncertain as to what I wanted to do in the first half of the year. And my typical routine when I'm kind of in that place is I try to think or try to imagine what area I really am excited to train in the most. And once I identify that, I kind of pick a race that matches that a bit. And that just helps with the specificity component of it. And also, these training blocks are big. There are a lot of time, a lot of energy invested in them. So the way I see it is if you don't enjoy the training plan or the preparation for it, the race probably won't go well. And plus, why are you doing it at that point anyway? So around mid-January or so, I kind of got the itch to be on the trails. So I ended up kind of skewing my training more to that rocky desert kind of environment to prepare for the San Diego 100, which I did in early June. And that kind of left that half of the season more trail based. So when I decided to do the race on August 24th in the Dome at the Pettit Center, I didn't necessarily have the timeline I would have preferred to get ready for it. Usually I like a nice kind of like 16-week block to do a full, more periodized approach to the race I'm doing. And for those curious, when I periodize for an ultra marathon, especially when it's like the 100-mile or 12-hour type duration, I'm looking at it kind of the same way I would periodize for any endurance event, but I'm sticking to the principle of keeping things specific to the race itself the closer I get to the race. So for those of you out there who haven't run an ultra marathon or don't know much about ultra marathons, you're probably familiar with, say, like a 5K or 10K half marathon or marathon training block, where when you periodize that, you're getting workouts that are more specific to your goal race pace as you get closer to it. So I'm essentially doing the same thing, but I'm just working from a completely different system on race day. As you can imagine, 100-mile race intensity is quite a bit different than 5K. So I'm doing some of those workouts that I would maybe do in like a 5K or 10K training block, but I'm just doing them much earlier in the training plan. So the reason I mentioned that is because I had that short timeline. So I kind of halved what I would normally use. So I essentially kind of eliminated that first early stage where I would do some of those like shorter interval sessions with those VO2 max type workouts in order to get in enough volume at kind of race intensity and those systems that are a little closer to that intensity. And with that said, I did do a pretty good kind of short interval, more kind of marathon-esque type training earlier in the year, kind of actually technically late last year, early this year, partly because my wife was doing some marathon work. I was just jumping in workouts and we were kind of doing like dual workouts together, more or less in the same area. So I did get a pretty good dosage of that just much earlier than I maybe normally would. And as you can imagine, I think one of the interesting things about some of these kind of race buildups is it gets very easy to look at someone's kind of final prep or their peak weeks and think, okay, well, that's the ticket. That's the recipe to success. when in reality, it's just a combination of a lifetime of work when you get down to it. So there is a lot of carryover. I've been very fortunate to be relatively injury free almost my entire running career. I had some hiccups when I was in college. But once I started ultra running, really, I've only had one injury that was significant enough to have me alter my race plans in any significant way. So I have a huge base of training mileage, and I've been kind of a high volume runner ever since I really got into the sport. So, I routinely average around 100 miles a week throughout the course of the year when you figure in off days and kind of peak training weeks and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I did like a more trail-based training plan going into San Diego. After San Diego in early June, I took a little bit of time to let that bounce back, put some effort into kind of just helping my wife at the Western States 100. And then really at the end of June, beginning of July is when I started to kind of get going a little more aggressively, I guess, towards specifically preparing for a flat 100 miler. And the way I did it for this is I wanted to get an idea of where my kind of aerobic systems were at. So what I do for that is I'll follow what would be kind of considered a pretty strict maximum aerobic function kind of principle, where I'm taking a specific heart range that I identify to be kind of like a high-end aerobic area, and I just try to like build up and load up volume in that. So kind of in the early stages of those sort of things, when I'm coming off the trails, takes a little bit of time to kind of get the mechanics and everything dialed back into that. And what I often see is I'll just see like my pace at a given heart rate start to drop. And that's kind of my sign or my compass as to that things are settling in nicely. And usually that ends up kind of plateauing at a certain point. And when that happens, I just operate under the assumption that I've kind of maximized that system. And then I can start kind of playing around with other things depending on what direction I'm going for the race itself. So the way this one kind of differed was I started out doing that, and my goal was essentially to get up to a pretty high amount of volume within that. So basically my compass was get as many miles in a week at that intensity as I possibly could without kind of overreaching and needing extra days off or getting hurt or something like that. And then once I got real comfortable with that, I scaled back a tad because 100-mile, 12-hour race intensity is just a little lower than that. Usually that system I just described ends up plateauing at kind of a high 5, low 6 minute per mile pace when weather is perfect and the terrain is flat. So like I wasn't planning on going out at like a 5:55 mile or anything like that at the Dome, or even a 6 flat for that matter. So that system is maybe a little bit of overspeed training relative to the race intensity itself. So I kind of pulled back a touch on that, mostly just so I could add a little more volume to the training and kind of get in some of those, what I guess you could call like a mega mile week that kind of framed my peak training block for this specific session. So once I kind of got that established, I started focusing on some higher mileage weeks. And I targeted about a 4-week stretch where my plan was to do kind of 3 big weeks with 1 deload week in there. When I say deload week, essentially what I'm saying is I'm going to just reduce volume and reduce intensity for a week, let everything kind of settle in before, take another crack at another kind of big build week. Part of the reason why I went with that approach was, I just got really inspired, I guess, at Western States watching Jim Walmsley and Jared Hazen just absolutely hit it out of the park with their races. I mean, those two guys just redefined what it is to run the Western States 100. And they're big volume, like high mileage guys. Jared Hazen, Jared actually, Jared did a high mileage type of an approach last year as he was leading into Western States, ultimately got injured and missed the race itself. So like there's an inherent risk doing this. Like you're on razor's edge. You're trying to take it to that last little bit. You're essentially trying to like capture that last single percentage, but you're increasing your likelihood of things going wrong by doing so. So you kind of have to make a decision for yourself. Like, do you want to almost guarantee showing up to race day feeling like uninjured, healthy, fresh? Or do you want to try to like get that last little percent and run the risk of not even making it to the race itself? So thankfully for Jared, it worked the second time around, and he ran the second fastest time at the Western States 100, right behind Jim Walmsley's course record. And So I took a little of inspiration and maybe a few clues from those guys' training blocks. I'm not a stranger to that, though. I've done it in the past. My biggest training block to date was actually probably leading into the Desert Solstice Track Invitational back in 2015, where I had like a 3-week build before my taper where I think I ran like 130, 150, 170 miles or something like that. It wasn't like uncharted territory for me. Sometimes what I notice after putting in big blocks like that and then doing a race is it takes a little more time to kind of get the energy back, both physically and mentally, to want to go and race hard again. So that's maybe the other trade-off too. If you're looking to race a lot more frequently, those type of approaches are maybe not going to work in that framework quite as well as if you're going to pick maybe a couple races and take the time afterwards to really bounce back. So let's get into some of this peak stuff. I'm going to try to share the screen here so you can see my Strava for these 4 weeks, and we can kind of look at them a bit. So you should be able to see my screen now. And what I have on here is this week right here from July 8th to the 14th was kind of the first move towards that. And like I kind of said before, the mindset here was to get as much volume as I could handle without feeling like I was overreaching, and try to squeeze as many kind of, 6:30 to maybe 6:40 minute mile pace in there, mainly because I identified before this event that I thought if I had a absolutely stellar day that I could probably handle about a 6:40 mile pace. So that was kind of my focus point or my compass. It was a little deceiving just because here in Phoenix during the summer, especially in July and August, it's super hot. So I'm not the type of person anymore who's going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and do a workout. I used to do that when I was teaching full time out of necessity, but now I have a little more flexibility in my schedule to kind of pick and choose. And I do value getting enough sleep as a huge component to training and recovery. So I didn't kind of force that by getting up super early. So there was a lot of runs here where it was getting up into the 100-degree temps, and then sometimes even up to 110 degrees, which when you think about it, probably meant I was training a little harder than maybe the pace indicated, versus a scenario where I did those same paces and it was like 70 or 80 degrees or something like that. But that was kind of the goal, the mindset. So this is the first week, just under 130 miles with kind of a capstone long run at the end of the week. And I'm going to highlight this one just because it kind of shows the specificity of this type of stuff. I found like a little dirt track about 3 or 4 miles from the house, and that's where I chose to kind of use as my long run race specific workouts of the week. So I'd head out there on the weekend usually and do, a 3 to 3.5 hour long run on that track loop. As you can see, it ended up being that first one was 3 hours, just over 27 miles, about a 6:36 per mile pace. So I was kind of right in what I was looking for the most part there. Then, that was my first kind of big week. So it was a little early to really need a lot of recovery yet at that point. So that second week was just, okay, I had a little more volume with that same guiding principle of relative 100-mile intensity. I took a little bit of an easier day on that Monday after the long run just to kind of let things settle in a bit. But then I kind of tried to take advantage of a couple of days here because my wife and I were actually out in Seattle. And Seattle actually had unseasonably cool temperatures this time of year than they normally do, which even if it had been hot there, it would have been relatively cool compared to Phoenix. But it was like 70 degrees there. So I was like, all right, let's load up a few big mileage days here while I can take advantage of that. So that's more or less why those kind of larger numbers are there in the beginning of the week there. But ultimately, I wanted to make sure I was ready to go for kind of my second key long run, which I did on Sunday at the end of that week to cap off that first 150-mile week. And this was actually my longest long run in the block. It ended up being 32.5 miles. It was 3.5 hours. And my pace was 6:31 per mile. So again, right kind of in that framework I was talking about. I tried to keep the intensity the same on each one of these long runs so that I didn't, so they could more or less gauge improvement, gauge to see if things are getting a little more efficient at a given intensity and all that sort of stuff. So this actually was when I started kind of getting excited about this whole experience at the Dome. Because like I said, I was working with a relatively condensed timeline. This race I did on the 24th actually wasn't going to be my A race for the second half of the year. But at the end of this week, that's when I started kind of switching gears a little bit and deciding like, okay, when I get there, if I feel really good, I'm not going to hold back. I'm just going to go for it. If my legs feel good, if everything's clicking and things are working out well on race day, I wasn't going to miss that opportunity. So this next week, July 22nd to the 28th, was that deload week I was talking about. So again, I reduced volume by about half of what my peak week to date had been for this block. I lowered intensity quite a bit. You can see if I highlight some of these, my pace is, I'm just out there spinning my wheels for the most part. So you're getting some like, low 8, high 7 pace runs in here. I'm just letting everything kind of seek in from those first 2 build-up weeks. And then moving in, getting kind of recouping my energies for this last kind of peak week of training before starting to kind of ease into a taper. So this last 150-mile week, the biggest difference between this one and those other 2 weeks was I implemented kind of a back-to-back long run. So I really backloaded my miles this week. It, if you look just at these 2 Saturday, Sunday runs here, it's 55.3 miles total. So, made up about 30% of my training volume that week. So I kind of just did what I was talking about before, hitting those kind of 6.5-ish type minute per mile, 640 pace type stuff. And these days leading in, just squeezing as much volume as I could feel like I could handle without overreaching too much, with the mindset that I was going to have a pretty big effort going on Saturday and Sunday. So on Saturday, similar to these other long runs, this one was 3 hours, 6:31 per mile pace. So kind of right in that same framework from those other ones. Sunday, I was actually really excited about this one because I anticipated this one to be a little more difficult. There to be a little more fatigue in my legs, but I actually felt better on this one. And my pace kind of reflected a little bit. I got maybe a little aggressive at the end just because you was feeling good and I pushed the pace down. If I click on this workout, it'll probably, maybe I'll actually do that real quick. You can see like it almost turned into a bit of a progression run at the end as I kind of finished it up. I got in some low 6 and high 5 at the end there. But overall average was pretty well within the framework of what I was looking for. And, that kind of capped off that last big training week. And then when I get to this point, I'm 3 weeks out from the race itself. So my goals kind of start to shift from, maximizing performance gains in training to focusing a little more on recovery as the primary goal. With that said, I'm still 3 weeks out. To kind of completely shut it down is probably not in my best interest unless I would need to for whatever reason. But I was feeling good. I felt like I did enough work in that training block to get a good stimulus and be ready for the race day, but not so much that I was getting into the taper feeling like a little fried or anything like that. So I took it easy, took a rest day here, and then kind of worked back into some stuff where in the taper, what I was aiming for mostly is reduced volume, but still at that kind of 100-mile race intensity for the most part. That's the thing I want to keep my body familiar with. So I'll recover because I'm reducing the volume fairly significantly, but I'll maintain that sharpness by kind of staying at that race system that system of training that I'm going to be using at race day. Similar with this week, once I got to the end of the week here and I was entering the week of the race, at that point, it's just everything is recovery based. Like if I woke up in the morning and felt terrible, I would have taken off or maybe gone for a walk or something. If I go for a run and I feel good, I just don't feel motivated to run fast, I'm going to scale back and go easy just to let everything set in. So spacing out the intensity, taking whatever rest you need going in. This is pretty typical look of where I would do leading into the week of 100-miler. Usually I'm kind of in that range of volume that you see here. And then this is Saturday. This is the race itself. Unfortunately, indoors, I couldn't get GPS data for it, but it came out to be 104.88 miles for the 12-hour and 11 hours and 19 minutes and 13 seconds for the 100-mile split there. And it was really interesting to me because, for one, I really trusted the training block that I did this time, and maybe a little more so than I have in the past too. And I think some of that is just my relative larger base of history being in kind of flat training environments. I really know my body well in those environments versus the trails. I'm still more or less feeling out a little bit, like kind of how my body responds to certain stimuluses, like what's a little too much, what's not enough, and then getting all those mechanics in line as well. So I would say I went into this race a little more confident than maybe I do in some other races in the past. And that certainly helped. Biggest difference, and I talked about this a bit in that previous video that I'll link to this, so I won't get into it too much. But my strategy at the race was a little more conservative than what I maybe would have done in the past. I knew I had just loads of volume at that kind of 640 intensity per mile pace. So I was a little more confident that I could just more or less dial that up and hold it all day versus needing to go out a little quicker because I was going to fade a bit at the end. And it played out almost just like that. I came through 50 miles in 5:40 and some change, and then came back the second 50 miles in 5:38 and some change for a 2 minute, 3 second negative split there. And I mean, that's it. That's kind of it. It was a condensed training. It was certainly a product of years and years of building though too. So again, I'll caution anyone looking at this, like, this isn't the 4-week recipe to nailing your 100-miler by any means. If you're interested in kind of my history in training and kind of where my volume gets to and how I ebb and flow throughout the course of the year, definitely go and check out my Strava. I log all my runs on there, so they're there for you to check out. That's it. So if you have any questions, please hit me up on social media. Instagram is @ZachBitter, Twitter is @ZBitter, or my website, zachbitter.com. You can send me a note on there if you want to. But hope you enjoyed this kind of reflection on the training buildup for the 12 hours in the Dome at the Pettit Center.